Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking at the animated western Rango. Even though Rango is an animated movie, does that mean that the intended audience is for children? Or do you need to be older to appreciate the movie? Or do you just need to be a fan of westerns to enjoy this movie? Before we get started, make sure to follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com. That way you can stay up to date on all MetrObelisk Radio uploads, no matter if I do platform exclusives on a platform that you are not watching this on. So without further delay, let's tear right into Rango. Like with all these retrospectives, we start off by looking at the creative team. Now this movie was directed by Gore Verbinski. Yes, the guy that worked on the first three Pirates of the Caribbean movies. He also worked on the story for this movie. He also did the remake of The Ring back in 2002, The Mexican with Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts, The Lone Ranger with Johnny Depp, and A Cure for Wellness with Dan DeHaan. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And this is the only animated movie that he has done so far as of the recording of this episode. Now, when looking at the writers, there's two writers on this movie. We'll start off with the first one, John Logan. He wrote the screenplay and the story for the movie. His other writing credits include Gladiator, The Time Machine with Guy Pearce, Star Trek Nemesis, Red with Bruce Willis, and the James Bond movies Skyfall and Spectre. And the last writer that we're going to talk about is James Ward Burkett. Now, he worked on the story for this movie, and he has only 5 writing credits to his name. This movie, along with the subsequent video game, a short called Yes and, Fractalis, and Coherence. Now we move on to the character analysis portion of this retrospective, so let's start off with the titular character himself, Rango, voiced by Johnny Depp. Now, he's just a regular chameleon in the beginning of the movie who gets thrown into the world from his normal habitat, which is that of a house pet. Rango wants to be the hero of his own story in the beginning, and he stumbles upon the town of Dirt in his quest to find water and lands in the saloon. People ask him where he's from, and he says that his name is Rango. Now, what's the character's actual name? We don't know, and his actual name is rather inconsequential to the story. He tells the story of how he killed the Jenkins brothers with just one bullet, and after this, he quote-unquote fights a bird and kills it with one bullet, effectively making him the sheriff of the town. Then we have Beans, who's voiced by Isla Fisher, and she finds Rango out in the desert and gives him a ride into town, and her character is the one that needs to sell off her ranch because there's no water, but she refuses, and then she later evolves into a love interest for Rango later in the movie. Then we have Roadkill, voiced by Alfred Molina. Now, he's not in the movie too much. He's the armadillo that gets run over in the very beginning that tells Rango about the town of Dirt. He also comes back in the very end after Rango has his meeting with the Spirit of the West to help him finish his journey. Then we have the mayor, which it's just the mayor, there's no name for him, voiced by Ned Beatty. He would go on to be the villain of the movie, but that doesn't become clear until the end of the second act, the beginning of the third act, right around that point. Then we get to Rattlesnake Jake, voiced by Bill Nighy. Yes, Bill Nighy playing yet another villain. He's the gunslinger who was kept away because of the bird that Rango killed with just one bullet, and it makes sense since birds are a natural predator to snakes. But after the bird was gone and Rango was getting too powerful, the mayor called him in to take care of Rango. Now, Rattlesnake Jake didn't kill Rango, but he exposed Rango for the fraud that he was up to that point, basically exposed the liar. Because if he killed Rango in that moment, all that would happen is they would, make him a martyr, and then the townspeople would still rise up, kill the mayor, kill Rattlesnake Jake, and then Rango is this big bad hero. And finally, we have the Spirit of the West, voiced by Timothy Olyphant. Now, he's a guy who wears a big brim hat and a poncho that drives in a golf cart and is armed with a metal detector. And I only bring him up because this character was a real missed opportunity in the sense to get Clint Eastwood to voice him instead. Timothy Olyphant, yes, was in a Western, HBO's Deadwood, but he was doing his impression of Clint Eastwood. Now let's move on to talk about the narrative of this movie. And this movie is pretty much a man with no name story. The same type of movie that Clint Eastwood really got known for. A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly are the first to come to mind. So the stranger strolls into town, helps the townspeople out helps out the townspeople to sort out their problems, and once the problem is solved, the stranger disappears just as mysteriously as he arrived. In this movie, the town of Dirt is facing a water shortage, and Rango, being the newly elected sheriff, agrees to help uncover the mystery surrounding the shortage. Now, he creates a posse to ride out with them when he discovers that the banker has died due to drowning, so how can he drown during a water shortage? And that's when the mystery comes into focus that someone is controlling the water, because, to simply put it, if you control the water, you control the land, which that's not really a flawed concept. Now, it's revealed that the mayor of Dirt was entering into a land deal where he would buy up the land for dirt cheap, no pun intended there, and then when he brought the water back, the land prices would skyrocket, basically making him filthy stinking fucking rich. Now, the reason he was going after Beans the way he was, because she was the very last holdout. She didn't want to sell that ranch, so finally he tried to strong arm her into selling by using Rattlesnake Jake to basically either sign this paper or you're dead. Very common out west with the whole carpet bagging, but that's a whole other discussion for another time, and I don't want to get political in this episode. And there's only 3 action scenes in the entire movie. The first being when Rango kills the bird. The second being the bank robbers when Rango and his posse try to steal the quote-unquote water back from them, and you get like a Flight of the Valkyries with, guys shooting revolvers and Gatling guns. And the final being the very end of the movie when Rango comes back into town after being exposed as a fraud when all the water gets brought back. Now, one thing that's really cool narrative-wise that this movie uses, they use a 4-bird mariachi band to basically be the narrators of the story and have accompanying music. You have the narrator, you have a couple of guys with guitars, you have a guy with the drums, and the final, you have the guy with the horns. Very similar to the storytellers of the Old West, where they would go from town to town with their instruments, tell the tall tales of gunslingers and cowboys and Indians, and get paid, and just move on to the next town. Now, how was this movie received at the time? Well, this movie has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 88% based on 221 critic reviews, and an audience score of 69% based on 120,119 audience reviews. This movie has a Metacritic score of 75 based on 35 critic reviews, and a user score of 7.6 out of 10 based on 677 ratings. And this movie sits on IMDb at a 7.2 out of 10 based on 228,640 reviews. Now, this movie was made on a budget of $135 million back in 2011, so if we adjust that for inflation in 2020 numbers, that would be today $153,878,118.07. And the movie grossed $245,724,603 worldwide, and if we adjust that for inflation in 2020 numbers, that would be a gross of $280,086,218.32. Now, I wouldn't call this movie an outright bomb, but it probably barely made its budget back in the theaters. Also, I want to stress this, take audience scores with a grain of salt because the numbers can be where they are because of review bombing. So in the end, this movie is more of a character-driven movie instead of a plot-driven movie. The first act is Rango strolling into town and becoming the sheriff. That's it. The second act is the quest for the water and Rango being exposed as the fraud. Okay, and then the final act starts with Rango going on his spiritual journey, then strolling back into town to save them from the corrupt mayor. Now, the animation in this movie has actually held up quite well, given that this movie is CG animated and not hand-drawn. Hand-drawn will always stand the test of time depending on the technique, but CGI is destined to age quicker with the progression of technology. You can tell that this is why the movie needed the $135 million budget. Some of that obviously went to securing the actors, but a lot of that probably went to future-proofing the animation. Given that this was a Western with not a whole lot going on in the background, it's easier to focus on the smaller details as an animator than if you had to go into a big city with large crowds of people. And really, this movie was made really during a weird time for animation. During this time, the studios believed that you needed to have a big-name actor or actors to sell an animated movie. Now, the first example to come to my head is Kung Fu Panda. That movie had Jack Black, Angelina Jolie, Jackie Chan, and Dustin Hoffman doing voices in that movie. And Kung Fu Panda did extremely well back in 2008. It did well enough to warrant 2 sequels, and I think there was even a television series spinoff. Now, if you were to ask me where this trend really started, I would probably tell you that it really started with Shrek. Shrek used Mike Myers, well known for comedies at the time, especially comedies like Austin Powers. Eddie Murphy, I think a big name back even in 2001, and I think everyone knows who Eddie Murphy is. Cameron Diaz as Princess Fiona, and John Lithgow as Lord Farquaad. Now, I'll end the episode off with this, tying it back to Rango. I would recommend that you watch this movie if you like the Clint Eastwood westerns, A Fistful of Dollars for a Few Dollars More, High Plains Drifter, or Two Meals for Sister Sarah. This movie is very reminiscent of those just in terms of the writing, just in terms of the style. And that's why I made the claim that it was a missed opportunity to not get Clint Eastwood to do the voice of the Spirit of the West, since the design for that character even mimicked his look from those movies. This is definitely not a quote-unquote baby's first Western. If there's one thing that this movie proves is that just because it's a PG-rated movie and the fact that it's animated, that doesn't mean that it's specifically made for children. I would not be surprised if the fan base for this movie skewed older than a movie like Barnyard, and I believe that's why we never saw a follow-up series on Nickelodeon for Rango like we did for Barnyard after Barnyard came out in 2006.